Thank you so very, very much, Will and Christy. What an honor you've conferred upon me this evening. I'm deeply moved by it. Senator Armstrong was, of course, a great civic leader. He was a great educational leader. But he was also a prophet and a man of extraordinary courage. And I want to focus my remarks this evening on prophecy and on courage. 41 years ago, a man with a craggy face and a beard came to Harvard University, where I was then a graduate student, to give the annual commencement address. The man was not a Harvard graduate. He was not a professor or a politician or a CEO. He was not an American. He did not speak English. His address, given in his native Russian with simultaneous English translation, was not especially well received. I suspect that some Harvard officials regretted their decision to invite him to speak. The man's name was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the brilliant novelist who had spent years as a political prisoner in the Soviet Gulag. He was a strong Orthodox Christian and a fierce critic of atheistic communism and Soviet tyranny. His writings had exposed the corruption, the cruelty, the injustice of the communist regime that had come to power in Russia in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and would remain in power until the day after Christmas, 1991. A regime that had enslaved its own people and reduced those of many other nations to serfdom under puppet governments. It was a regime as totalitarian and as murderous as the Nazi regime in Germany, which the US and Britain had allied with the Soviets in World War II to defeat. Now, in 1978, the Cold War was raging, and the US was still reeling from its humiliation in the disastrous war in Vietnam. Anti-Americanism was flourishing both abroad and at home. Many Americans, particularly young Americans of the time, had lost their faith in their country. They'd lost their faith in their country's institutions, in its principles, in its culture, in its traditions, in its way of life. Some proposed communism as a superior system. Many suggested what came to be known as moral equivalency between American democracy or democratic capitalism and Soviet communism. By 1978, to suggest such equivalency had become a mark of sophistication, something to distinguish one from the allegedly backward Hicks and Rubes who believed in the superiority of the American to the Soviet system. Well, there were many such sophisticated people at Harvard, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn came to Harvard to confront them. His speech was not, however, an encomium to America or to the West. On the contrary, it was a severe critique, one might even say a prophetic rebuke, and a warning. Now, of course, Solzhenitsyn did not argue for the moral equivalency of the Soviet regime and the American, much less for the superiority of the Soviet system. He hated communism in all its dimensions, and he loathed the gangsters who ruled the Soviet Empire. What he faulted America and the West for in that speech at Harvard was its abandonment of its own moral and especially spiritual ideals and identity. Solzhenitsyn viewed the West's weakness, including its weakness in truly standing up to the Soviets, as the fruit of materialism, consumerism, self-indulgent individualism, emotivism, and narcissism. In a word, the immorality in which we had permitted ourselves to sink. Solzhenitsyn, by then the legendary human rights activist, warned America and the West that we had become too focused on rights and needed to refocus on obligations. We had come to embrace a false idea of liberty, conceiving of it as doing as one pleases rather than as the freedom to fulfill one's human potential, care for one's family, care for one's community, build one's business, honor one's conscientious duties to family, to neighbor, and to God. Now, at the heart of this moral confusion and collapse, Solzhenitsyn argued, was a loss of faith, and with it, the loss of a particular virtue, the virtue of courage. Here are Solzhenitsyn's own words. Quote, "A decline in courage may be the most striking feature which an outside observer notices in the West in our days. The Western world has lost its civic courage, both as a whole and separately, in each country, each government, each political party, and of course in the United Nations. Such a decline in courage is particularly noticeable among the ruling groups and the intellectual elite, causing a loss of courage by the entire society. Of course, there are many courageous individuals, but they have no determining influence on public life." Now, I submit to you today, speaking now in my own voice again, despite the American victory in the Cold War, for which we should all be grateful, grateful to our military, grateful to great leaders like Ronald Reagan, grateful to our people, despite the victory and the collapse and disappearance of the Soviet Union, nothing has really changed that would diminish the force of Solzhenitsyn's words. The virtue we lack today, I submit to you, my friends, the virtue we lack, and it is an indispensable virtue, is courage, and we must recover it. We conservatives must lead our people in recovering the virtue of courage. We must not permit ourselves to be intimidated, to be bullied by a cultural elite or by anybody else into silence or acquiescence with what we know to be wrong. Our young men and women, and I know there are young men and women out there, our young men and women must regain the virtue of courage. Not to defend us from a hostile foreign power armed with nuclear weapons like the old Soviet Union, but to protect us as a people from a far more dangerous foe, a truly deadly enemy, our own worst selves. At all times and in all places, all of the virtues are needed. No virtue is superfluous or dispensable. But it seems that at any given time, in any given particular society, there is a certain virtue, one or another, that is lacking and therefore much needed. Moreover, because the virtues are integrally connected with one another, they're like a network, the loss of one virtue tends to weaken and imperil all the others. Or worse, the loss of a given virtue threatens to turn the other virtues into engines of vice. Let me explain what I mean. Let's take a different virtue, the virtue of compassion. It is an essential virtue, like all the others. We need compassion. It can move us to work selflessly and even heroically for the good of our fellow human beings, especially the needy and suffering. We cannot do without compassion. We rightly praise the compassionate for the good deeds they do in caring for the least, the last, and the lost. But consider what can happen when compassion remains strong, but other virtues, such as love of truth, justice, liberty, have eroded or disappeared. Operating by itself in isolation from the other virtues, compassion, a great virtue, can motivate every manner of evil, from the killing of the unborn in abortion to the killing of the disabled and frail elderly in euthanasia. We can convince ourselves that kindness calls for such things. Let's not forget that well before the Nazis gave eugenics a bad name, well-intentioned, decent, compassionate people in places such as Germany, England, and the United States embraced eugenics precisely out of a sense of compassion. It was they, the elite, the progressives, the people who had compassion, who invented the doctrine of Lebenswürdiges Leben, lives unworthy of life. Because they did not want people to suffer, they supported things like mandatory sterilization for some classes of persons, and even mercy killing for those whose lives they considered so burdensome as to be not worth living. People the Nazis would then come along and label useless eaters. Now we ourselves, let's not fool ourselves here, we ourselves live at a time of great moral confusion. If anything, our situation is worse today than it was when Solzhenitsyn visited Harvard in 1978. There has been, to borrow a concept from the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, a transvaluation of values in many spheres. What is good has been redefined in elite sectors of the culture as bad. What is bad has been redefined as good. To defend the historic conception of marriage as the conjugal union of husband and wife is to be accused of hatred by the woke progressives. To stand up for the sanctity of human life in all stages and conditions, beginning with the defense of the precious and vulnerable child in the womb, is to risk being labeled a misogynist. To speak out for religious freedom and the rights of conscience is to invite being smeared as a bigot. Now, it is not pleasant to be subjected to these types of abuse and defamation. And these days it goes well beyond unpleasantness, and I know that many of you know this. To speak moral truth to cultural power is to put at risk one's standing in polite society, one's educational and employment opportunities, the success of one's business, one's professional advancement. It is to place in jeopardy treasured friendships and sometimes even family relationships. It is to subject one's business to punishment by the misbegotten application of anti-discrimination statutes, or to boycotts organized by powerful advocacy groups, bankrolled by the plutocracy that is increasingly dominant in 21st century corporate America. And the more people, in reaction to these threats, acquiesce or go silent out of fear, the more dangerous and therefore more difficult it becomes for anyone to speak the truth out loud, even if they know it in their hearts. If we want our children, if we want our young men and women to be able to stand up on a college campus and not be rolled and not be intimidated and not be bullied, but to speak the truth and to speak their minds, we had better set an example in our own adult lives, be role models for them. Anyone who succumbs to the intimidation and bullying, anyone who acquiesces or goes silent out of fear, not only harms his or her own character and fails in his or her own duty to bear faithful witness, he or she also makes things harder for others. We owe it not only to ourselves to be courageous, as Jack Phillips here in Colorado has been courageous, but to our brothers and sisters too. And because we owe it to ourselves and others, we owe it to God. I think that Bill Armstrong would be the first to say amen to that point. Our own worst selves, we human beings, our own worst selves are ourselves when we lack the self-mastery that possession of the virtues, including the virtue of courage, makes possible. Our worst selves are slaves not to alien masters, but to our own weaknesses. Our own worst selves are what we are encouraged by so much of our culture today to be. The culture encourages our children to be their worst selves. When we are our own worst selves, what we seek are ephemeral and ultimately meaningless things, such as pleasure, status, social acceptability, wealth, power, celebrity, things that are not bad in themselves, since they can be used for good things, good ends, but things that are not good in themselves, or at least ultimate goods, either. And they can lure us into supposing that and acting as if they were. When we are our worst selves, we human beings, we fail in our duty to bear faithful witness because a desire for ephemeral things and a fear of losing them paralyzes us. When we are our worst selves, we lead lives that are marked by those vices against which Solzhenitsyn railed 41 years ago at Harvard: materialism, consumerism, self-indulgence, narcissism. We place the focus on doing as we please no matter what we please, getting what we want no matter what it is we happen to want. instead of seeking what's true because it's true, what's good because it's good, what's right because it's right. Instead, though, when we are our worst selves, we seek what we desire for no reason other than we desire it. Indeed, we fall into the profound moral and philosophical error of imagining that the human good consists in the satisfaction of our desires. Thus it is that we rationalize our failing to behave like rational creatures, creatures made in the image and likeness of God, blessed with the powers of reason and freedom, and behaving instead like brute animals, like slaves of our passions. By definition, slaves to passion can never be masters of themselves, and no one who lacks self-mastery can practice and exemplify the virtue of courage. Courage always presupposes a willingness to sacrifice oneself for others or for something higher, whether we're talking about the sacrifice of the Christian martyrs or the sacrifice of the men on the beaches of Normandy, or the sacrifices that a politician might make in standing up for what's right rather than what's convenient. Someone who is not a master of himself, someone who cannot rise above his own wants, desires, passions, fears, can never give himself to others or live for others or for something higher. Self-mastery is a precondition of the willingness and ability to live self-sacrificially. One cannot give oneself if one is not master of oneself. Lacking self-mastery, one simply has nothing to give. Now, I've suggested that Solzhenitsyn saw a connection between the decline of courage and the loss of faith. 5 years after his Harvard address, in a 1983 speech accepting the Templeton Prize in Religion, Solzhenitsyn stated this in the most explicit terms. The title of the speech could not have made the point more clearly. That title was, "Men Have Forgotten God." Here is the opening paragraph of Solzhenitsyn's speech. As a survivor of the communist Holocaust, I am horrified to witness how my beloved America, my adopted country, is gradually being transformed into a secularist and atheistic utopia where communist ideals are glorified and promoted, while Judeo-Christian values and morality are ridiculed and increasingly eradicated from the public and social consciousness of our nation. Under the decades-long assault and militant radicalism of so many so-called liberal and progressive elites, God has been progressively erased from our public and educational institutions to be replaced by all manner of delusion, perversion, corruption, violence, decadence, and insanity, unquote. 36 years later, who can deny the truth of Solzhenitsyn's lament? A lament for a country that he adopted, a country that he considered his. Today, the cultured despisers of religion and Judeo-Christian values do not speak ordinarily of communism or its ideals, communism having been discredited by Soviet gangsterism. They speak instead of liberation or equality or socialism or social justice, by which they seek to marginalize and stigmatize the principles of Judeo-Christian morality and justify acts and practices that contravene those principles. And they are certainly aggressive, moving, to cite just one of many examples, from the legalization of abortion to the demand for its approval and even public funding, to the insistence that people or institutions, including religious institutions such as Catholic hospitals, who refuse to perform or refer to abortions, be made to suffer professional or civic penalties or disabilities. Now, what is behind all this? According to Solzhenitsyn, the moral decline of the West has behind it the same factor that produced the horrors of communism, namely this: men have forgotten God. People worship themselves, deify their own desires, fall into an idolatry of the self because they have forgotten that there is something, indeed someone, even higher. My son David, who's with us this evening, said to me in the car as we were driving today, made the point that people will have a religion, and you had better believe in God in order to not worship yourself. And that's absolutely right. We forget God, And absent faith, how can we muster the courage to be bold witnesses, as Solzhenitsyn himself did, to essential moral values in an increasingly hostile culture and world? How can there be courage on our campuses, in our businesses, in our civic activity, in our churches? How can there be courage in the absence of real, true, burning faith? Friends, that's because fear of being stigmatized, fear of being ostracized, fear of being called names, fear of being labeled. Fear is a very powerful emotion, very powerful indeed. And faith alone can overcome fear. When people forget God, when they come to suppose that they don't need Him or need His grace or His guidance or forgiveness, when they fall into the hubristic error of imagining that they are too smart and too sophisticated to believe in God, a catastrophe always ensues. This was no novel insight or discovery of Solzhenitsyn's. It is the central teaching and theme of the prophets. All prophets, not just the biblical ones, though them too. In March of 1863, another man with a craggy face and a beard spoke to the American people words of critique and prophetic warning of precisely the sort spoken by Solzhenitsyn at Harvard and in his Templeton address. Abraham Lincoln, reflecting on the catastrophe of the Civil War and on its causes, issued a proclamation of a national day of prayer and fasting. What he said in the proclamation was in a sense echoed by Solzhenitsyn, and we would do well to heed it today. We should write it and put it up on our walls or on our refrigerators. We should send our kids off to college with the quotation I'm about to give you from Lincoln in their bags, in their knapsacks. Here's what Lincoln said. Whereas it is the duty of nations as well as men to own their dependence upon the overruling power of God, to confess their sins and transgressions in humble sorrow, yet with assured hope that genuine repentance will lead to mercy and pardon, and to recognize the sublime truth announced in the Holy Scriptures and proven by all of history, that those nations only are blessed whose God is the Lord. And insomuch as we know that by His divine law, nations, like individuals, are subjected to punishments and chastisements in this world, may we not justly fear that this awful calamity of civil war which now desolates our land may be but a punishment inflicted upon us for our presumptuous sins to the needful end of our national reformation as a whole people? We have been the choicest recipients, Lincoln goes on, we have been the recipients of the choicest bounties of heaven. We have been preserved in these many years in peace and prosperity. We have grown in numbers and wealth and in power as no nation has ever grown before. But we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us in peace and multiplied and enriched and strengthened us. And we have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. Intoxicated with unbroken success, we have become too self-sufficient to feel the necessity of redeeming and preserving grace, too proud to pray to the God who made us. Those were Lincoln's words to the American people in the context of the awful calamity of the Civil War. Of course, it's been more than a century and a half since Lincoln spoke those words, and yet it is as if he wrote them yesterday and directed them to us today. Yes, as a culture, we have forgotten God. That is reflected in our laws, in the edicts of our courts so often, in so many of our public policies, in our news and entertainment media, in our schools and universities, in our economic and cultural institutions, on the streets of our cities, and even, alas, in many homes and some churches. We have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts, to quote Lincoln, that our blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. And as a result, we find ourselves in the condition so accurately and brutally diagnosed by Solzhenitsyn. But my dear friends, my dear, dear friends, what has been forgotten can be remembered. What has fallen into decay can be renewed. What has been lost can be rediscovered. But for these things to happen, those who have not forgotten God and sincerely seek to do his will must look to him for the grace necessary to be his courageous and faithful witnesses, to be, in the words of another modern prophet, Pope John Paul II, signs of contradiction to a culture, to a world that has forgotten God. This, please allow me to say to this gathering of Western conservatives, this is our mission at its most basic, at its most fundamental. We have much to do, but at the foundation, this is our mission. We must remember God to a world that has forgotten him. We must have the courage to do that by the example of our lives, as well as by the words of our mouths, responding to the promptings of both faith and reason, and never imagining that the two can be separated in our moral witness. We must be the salt and light that repairs what is broken and points the way to true freedom for those who have fallen into forms of slavery that are all the more abject for masquerading as liberation. Thank you again for the wonderful honor. Good night.